Shalene, thank you again for joining us for this conversation. We're thrilled to have you. And I wanted to start the conversation by allowing you to talk a little bit about your personal and professional background. I know you have extensive experience in restorative justice, and you also have worked in different kinds of settings. And so, if you could talk a little bit about your personal history, how you came to do the work in
Mm,
restorative justice, and what attracts you to this kind of work, and what parts of it do you find to be really, really challenging?
Great question. Thank you for that. I appreciated getting those questions because it was, you know, grounding to think about, oh, how, you forget to stop and just think, like, how did I end up here? How did all of this come together? I started my early career in social work, in child and adolescent mental health, in working with youth who were in inpatient mental health treatment. Then I moved into doing work in refugee resettlement, both here in the States, in Chicago. And then I spent 5 years living in Kenya doing refugee resettlement there and heard I couldn't even count how many thousands of stories I heard from people who had been harmed by other people in their community and were just sitting in this purgatory of no, healing, no resolution, sort of wanting the system of resettlement to provide some of that for them and just feeling the heaviness and the angst, and then also getting the, sort of counter experience during part of my time there. I went to Rwanda in April, where they have a month of mourning, to just, sit and commemorate the genocide, the 1994 genocide. And I had worked with many Rwandese refugees over the course of my time. I had already worked with so many Rwandese refugees, and they did sort of reenactments of the Gacaca courts there. I may not be saying that right. And which was basically the reconciliation courts after the genocide. And it was surrogate responsible persons and surrogate harm persons coming together to talk about what, the ripple of that harm was like for them. This was in 2011. So, many, many years later. And I was so moved by thinking about people being so committed to their community that they would choose to sit in those conversations and understand that, like, this was all so much bigger than this moment of, like, really, really acute harm. And so that, like, you have those experiences that kind of sit with you. You're not totally sure what they're going to generate, but it just was in such a stark contrast to the purgatory that I felt like a lot of these other, people were experiencing. And I came back to the States and I had my daughter, or she was born there, and we moved back here and started working for CASA and saw just more people being impacted by systems that they did not ask to be involved in. Kids, youth in foster care who are being harmed, who get thrust into this thing that is not taking care of them, that does not see them as an individual. And then I worked for Rocky Mountain Victim Law Center, and we helped enforce the Victims' Rights Act for folks who had experienced violent crime in Colorado. And they were going through the prosecution of their perpetrators. And again, just this like sense of like this thing that we've sort of been told is going to do something for us is doing nothing. Like some of these, mostly women, would sit in these cases for 4 or 5 years and wait, for their moment to like give their victim impact statement. And we'd talk about it after, and they're like, I don't feel what I thought I was going to feel after that. And so I kind of, through all of those things, I came to Bright because I wanted to moved to Boulder County with my daughter, and I wanted to start exploring, deepening my fundraising career and hoped, to get into a leadership role as executive director. And at the time, LCJP was hiring a development person, and I had no idea what I was getting into. And the first time I got to really experience a restorative process, I had already been hired. I came to the restorative practices orientation that organization does on a monthly basis. And I was just blown away by what could transpire between me and a perfect stranger who we had all this shared history. And I was just like, oh no, this is going to totally change how I approach this work. And so I think what is inspiring to me and what keeps me here is all of the things that we do are totally outside of the system. And that is so critical after, watching people be harmed and their harm be exacerbated by the system after they had already experienced all of, this injustice personally. And just like, I don't want to do that anymore. I do not want to participate in things that are, yeah, just continuing the harm and the exploitation and the marginalization. And so I really feel so proud that Bright is, able to do the work that we do in partnership with systems, but it being a community-based organization totally outside of a system is critical because a system is going to protect itself and always is going to be insulated and have its best interests in mind first and foremost. And so I feel really grateful for the legacy of the women. I'm truly, standing on the shoulders of, many, several women who came before me who understood why it was so important that we do this work in the way that we do it. So yeah, that's kind of the bigger picture.
What a unique perspective you have had to see kind of so many different types of people in different kinds of settings who have
Yeah,
experienced harm
totally.
and what's been wrong with the system that it actually didn't promote
Yeah.
healing.
Yeah.
And so I'd love for you to talk about what is unique about restorative justice. So help
Yeah.
our audience understand what it is and what
Mhm.
it is not, right? So, what are some of
Yeah.
the common misperceptions that people have
Mhm. Mhm.
about engaging in restorative justice?
I feel like the primary misconception is people think restorative justice is only about the offender. We don't like to use the term offender. We use the term responsible person and harmed party. We don't use the word victim. That was very intentional, something the organization had done years ago. I think that was a shift happening nationally. But I think people really think this program is only about offenders and giving offenders an easy way out of accountability, and that there's nothing that they're going to learn unless they go through this really punitive system and they have someone with, in an up power role, up power position over them telling them you have to do this, and that could be the only motivation for someone to want to change their behavior or repair what happened. So I think that's the primary thing. I think people think it can't work. And actually that's, in comparison to the success rate of the criminal justice system, which depending on what demographic you're looking at and what state and all the things can be as low as like 30%. And that 70% of people are going to go right back into it. Our recidivism is generally less than 10%. And so that when people are like, this thing doesn't work, and I know that they're, what good could just a conversation do? That's like the place I like to start is, this thing that you think is working is actually also not working. um, and I think also there's a thinking that the isolation is like the motivation for people to change their behavior, and that is also, I think, totally opposite of what we find. That this process is really we train our volunteers to participate in two roles in our restorative process. So one is a community member, and folks literally get trained to come into our restorative process to speak from their perspective. All they are asked to do is talk about how does this crime that this person is here taking responsibility for impact me as someone who's living in this community. And it could be, I'm trying to sell my house and now we have this graffiti in the neighborhood. And so I don't feel as proud to bring people here to show my home when there is graffiti on the fences, or, the lampposts are broken, or, any number of things. There's so many ways that people can bring their own experience into that. And then we train facilitators, volunteer facilitators, to be the multi-partial people who kind of just keep the whole process moving and making sure that we're respecting the ground rules. Everyone is getting a chance to speak. The person who is there is taking responsibility, and it's really about storytelling and reflecting back. The person who is responsible has to literally reflect back everything that they heard each individual say about how they had been impacted by that crime. So that's, the person who actually was harmed, maybe that person's parents, the community members. Sometimes we have what we call natural community members, like their teacher or something, who also participate. And so people think it's easy. It's not easy. And we have some folks come to us afterward and say, I honestly would have just rather had the ticket, because this is a lot of work. It's a lot of internal work, and it's a mindset shift. And we have to kind of inch people along in that, but it is way more effective. And I think there's yeah, when people are kind of conveying those misconceptions to me, I just invite them to come and participate in the process. And if they still feel like it doesn't work after that, we can have a conversation. So yeah, those are the primary things I hear.
Yeah, I love the lifting up of, like, the comparison of the punitive system that we currently have doesn't work, and here's a system that does, and here are the reasons why. And I'd like for you to unpack a little bit of the reasons why, right? Tell us what restorative justice is, what are the principles that it's based on. I heard you use very intentional language around person being harmed, person who did the harm, and so talk about how that language reflects, like, the values and principles embedded in this perspective of restorative justice.
I mean, it's really an individual. Like every person who participates in the restorative process has a role. And each one of those roles is really important to making the process work. And so everyone has to be seen as an individual. It's a strengths-based process that is a part of what we do in the pre-conferencing and the intake process, is asking folks, tell us what your strengths are. What would your friends say about you? What would your parents say about you? What is the last thing you did that you felt proud of? I have had to stand in front of judges in various parts and wearing different hats in my life. I have never had a judge ask me, "What do you think your greatest strength is?" You're standing up there just like, this person, I'm in this thing that I don't understand. I don't totally know how I'm supposed to show up here. I feel like if I do or say the wrong thing, that's just going to, compound the consequences that I'm facing right now. And so in the restorative process, it is about we spend a lot of time with our volunteers helping them have skills, and how do you build rapport with the people who are going to be in that circle, both the folks who have been harmed and the people who are responsible. A huge part of our training is just that, like, rapport building, and we have several steps in the process. They do an intake with our staff, and then they pre-conference with our volunteers, and then they go into the more formal conference. And each step of that process is important to that relationship building piece and community and trust. you're not going to show up and be vulnerable and say the really hard things in a room full of strangers if there's no one in that room that you trust, especially youth. And it's amazing to see what happens to them. They'll come and they'll sit and everyone feels awkward. There's still a little bit of like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Often the kids have their hoods over their head and they're, like sitting in their seat like this and they don't want to talk to anybody. And it like undoubtedly every time about a third of the way through, once we've gotten through them reflecting back what they heard and the impacts and the space has been held and everyone they're not hearing you're a bad person. I feel all these terrible things about you. I don't ever want to see you in my community again. Instead, they're hearing it's okay. Like none of us want to be remembered by a bad decision we made on a bad day. And you can just feel like their whole body, like, wow, I just said and took responsibility for something I'm really not proud of. And everyone in this room is still telling me I'm glad I'm here. And I can continue to be here and I don't have to isolate myself from out of shame or out of guilt. So I feel like that the respect, so the 5 R's is the other like really critical component I think of the process. Relationship, respect, responsibility, repair, and reintegration. And those are the pillars of the work. And we incorporate those, we teach those. The people who are participating in the process learn them, and our ground rules for each restorative process is based on those things. And they're all interrelated. It's, a pyramid. If you take one out, you're not going to be able to move to that next place. If there's no repair, you can't reintegrate. And those are the, work and heart of the founder of Teaching Peace, which was the organization before we were Bright Collaborative. And I hope that she will. I always like to say, hope it's okay with her that I add a 6th R, which is resilience. Because I feel like if you have all of those things in place, you're just building the resilience and strengthening the community fabric. It's really beautiful and really moving. Youth are their brains are developing, their identity is developing when they're having these experiences. It is not difficult for them to sort of extrapolate, what they're doing and make this into parts of their identity. And you can see the shame and the guilt on them when they come in and start talking to you. They don't want to make eye contact. They don't want to share the things about themselves that they do think are good. They have a hard time hearing from other people what their strengths are. And eventually, after we have, gone through a part of the restorative process and they have like understood and felt they could do this really, really hard thing that they probably did not think they were going to be able to do before they sat down in that restorative process, and they have held it and heard all of these impacts, and that everyone is there still saying to them like, you are a valuable part of our community, you are a valuable person, you deserve to be here, you deserve to be a part of what we're doing. You can literally you can feel it all sort of like fall away, and like their shoulders, like drop, they pull their hood back. Usually that's when we take a break. They're more like interactive and chatty, and just like their shift and how they are seeing themselves and what they believe they're capable of is really phenomenal. We call it the magic of the circle. It truly is like a magical process to watch it all unfold.
Thank you so much, Shalene, for explaining what the process looks like and how it goes
Yeah.
through,
Yeah.
and what those principles are, and how
Mhm.
transformative the principles in operation really are, right? Like focusing on individuals as
Mhm.
valuable and more
Mhm.
important
Mhm.
than the
Mhm.
worst thing they've ever done,
Yeah.
and giving people the opportunity to both
Yeah.
take responsibility and be accepted. I I can imagine for any of us that that would feel really amazing to be able to release some of the things that we've done that we feel shame about and still take accountability and still be a member of a community that we value. So, thank you for giving us a glimpse into that kind of process. And I want to contrast that with the current criminal justice system that we have, which does focus on coercion, it focuses on punitiveness, it focuses on isolation, and it is itself a system that commits lots of harms to not only the people who kind of get caught up in it, but their families and communities. And when we think about how so many Black and Latinx youth have been criminalized, continue to be criminalized. What hope does restorative justice as a framework, as a principle, hold for healing the collective wounds that these communities are experiencing and for helping us to address the really harmful aspects of our society, like racism and sexism and homophobia, that are embedded in this criminal justice system?
I do this because I feel like it is the thing that holds all of the possibility for us to be able to do that. It is, you know, it is truly a mindset shift. It's a practice, and once you experience it, it changes. It's the word that you just used is perfect. It's transformational, and we include officers in the restorative process. So they come and participate and offer the the impacts to their part of the community through this of, I'm here having to we have some officers who are so diligent in, coming to the conference and saying, in that 1 hour that I was there at the park with you, there were 30 other calls for service. And some of those calls for service were really significant things that people in the community really needed support with. And I wasn't able to be there. I was here with you and that's okay. But here's how again the ripple of what you're doing is impacting all of us, and it is to me that part is maybe it's both, like, such a gift, and it is also really challenging, and I'm so grateful that we have this long partnership with Longmont Public Safety. When people reach out and say, "How in the world do you do this?" The first thing I say is, "You have to get your public safety department on board." That is, like, number 1, and then the city prosecutor or the county prosecutor, however you're gonna approach it, because it humanizes everyone. And we have had to really ask hard questions about what are the impacts and the potential for re traumatizing people by bringing law enforcement officers into the space. How are we going to honor that? This may be impacting people's ability to show up because they have experienced, their family has experienced, their neighbors, their community have experienced significant harm because of law enforcement. And we still don't have a perfect answer to that. We check in with folks and ask them, it's all a consent based process, and say, we'd like to have an officer here. How does that feel for you? Kind of give them a history and grounding of like, these are folks we do have close relationships with. They're also human. They're also causing harm. And the good news is, if something happens in the circle process where those power dynamics, that racism, that sexism is playing out, we have a way to talk about it. And we can do that and have had to sometimes in conferences where a facilitator will say, and it's not just with law enforcement, it happens with dads probably the most because law enforcement get a lot of training from us about how to show up in that space. Parents don't as much. And so sometimes parents talk for their kids a lot, they get impatient, and they're kind of just replaying a lot of those same things. So we have to pause and say, we need to acknowledge what's happening here right now, or I'm sensing something's coming up for you, and we can address it in the circle. Let the circle decide what to do with it. So I feel really grateful.
I'm really curious about how restorative justice engages collective wounds that happen on a system level, right? And the fact that you were able to observe that dynamic in Rwanda that experienced this genocide, right? The harm is not just individual to individual, or even at a local community, but it's something about the system, something about group identity, something about the way in which people understand the other that allow them to act in these behaviors that are really outside of what we would want as a community. And the philosophy that it's in the community coming together and having these kinds of engagements that we can deal with that kind of collective system. Now, I know the US is not Rwanda.
Sure,
But I
sure.
am interested in
Mhm,
particular with
mhm,
engagement with law enforcement.
mhm,
If
mhm,
you have examples or have seen opportunities where the system, instead of trying to protect
mhm,
itself, is
mhm,
actually able
mhm,
to
mhm,
embrace the
mhm,
harm that it
mhm.
has done on a
Yeah,
collective level, and
yeah,
where communities who have
yeah,
been harmed by
yeah.
the system are able
Mhm,
to get some healing. I know
mhm.
that's not the, like, total
Yeah,
focus, but I'm
yeah,
curious if you've
yeah.
seen any of that.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's such a good I think there's, like, a two-part thing. So the macro level part of that is in acknowledging that our systems are inherently racist, inherently biased. 3 years ago now, the city of Longmont committed to not ticketing any youth. So we removed all officer discretion from whether or not youth should receive restorative justice. And so the work that had been happening previously was officers were trained to sort of assess for accountability at the time of the call for service, and just saying those words, I'm like, that is ridiculous. That is ridiculous. I am living in a white body. I have a lot of privilege. I have also had, some scary interactions with law enforcement. And I cannot imagine trying to show up as my best self when I am being busted for something that I just did. So to think that that was the moment that people had to opt into this thing is we understood as as bright as public safety, as the probation department, and in Longmont we have children, youth, and families who provide a lot of the other interventions. Like, that isn't working. And so I think the first way of sort of moving to repair that collective wound is like, we can take out the subjectivity of that. We can just decide we are committed to making sure that youth are not getting channeled into this thing, and that we are going to address the underlying need behind the behavior. All behavior is an expression of a need. So, what are those other things that need to be addressed? And let's start there. So, that is, as far as I know, Longmont is one of two cities in the entire nation that have that pre file deflection program. Colorado, in the last session, just passed to infuse $10 million over 3 years for community based organizations here in our state to implement this pre file deflection. I think a lot of people are understanding is not working. And also now, because of the moment we're in, and people are not going to have as much money to run their local governments. We are a massive cost savings compared to, there's not a lot of great data on how much a municipal court process costs, but it's $140,000 a year to incarcerate one youth in Colorado. It's roughly $18 to $25,000 to have one of them on probation. So that's a massive opportunity for us as a state, and I appreciate the commitment of all of our policymakers here to, help. It's a little bit of an experiment. It's like, well, one tiny little municipality is doing this and it's working, and so we've had some really fierce advocates. So I hope that this thing that we decided to do as a way to approach changing the harm that systems are causing will sort of take on in, all of these other places. So that's a huge, um, yeah, I'm excited about what that's going to mean.
I share that hope, which is why we were thrilled to have you here to talk about the fabulous work you're doing and to publicize that so other people can see there are much more effective, developmentally appropriate, harm reducing strategies that we can use that also have the benefit of saving money. So it's win, win, win. And so thank you for the thought that, your organization has put into this and mapping this out that you can be hopefully a model that would pilot and kind of move through the country. So I want to talk a little bit. We've talked about the engagement with law enforcement. I'd like for you to talk about the program that you have, Your Story, Your Power, the
Yeah,
YSYP.
yeah,
It seems like a fabulous approach
yeah,
to
yeah.
restorative justice, and I'm hoping that you could share a little bit about what it
Mm,
is. Why did
mhm.
your organization feel the need to create this kind of program?
Yeah,
Because it's
yeah,
different than the circles we've been talking
yeah,
about.
yeah.
And how do you see that program really promoting, again,
Mhm,
healing, understanding, and leadership among the
mhm.
youth who participate?
Totally. Yeah. We run that program in partnership with Mirror Image Arts, which is also a restorative based organization in Denver. Their tagline is rehearsal for reality. So they're doing a lot of like work in schools with kids, helping them just like act out these situations, doing all incredible number of things. Amazing, amazing partnership. And that program started because there was a serious increase of minors. This is in like 2018, of minors who were in possession of various substances in Longmont. And it was like this big uptick. And so our public safety department was like, what restorative programming could we do that would like specifically address substance use, and lots of marijuana, lots of vaping, mostly those things, not as much alcohol, but people using substances is actually a really challenging thing to address in a restorative process because the harm, it's a lot more nuanced, and the harm is often really about the person. The harm is to yourself. And that repair process, when we're, asking folks, like, what do you think is going to be needed to repair to like move forward? They will always think about like what the community is going to need, what their parents might need, their siblings, the other people in the circle. They always address harm to themselves last. And it's challenging to get them to really understand what those impacts could be. So this program was developed with a young person who at the time was actually incarcerated, and Mirror Image Arts was doing a lot of programming in that youth detention facility here in Colorado. And it started with actual conversations between that young man and law enforcement of like, what would he have needed? His harm was really significant, and there was a substance component, but it was much deeper than that. But still, he had the long history of having interactions with the criminal justice system, and the two of them literally sitting in dialogue together while we observed, sort of extrapolated what we were hearing from that, what this person was saying would have been helpful for them, what law enforcement was saying, like, this is what I want people to know. This is what I wish we could be doing in these situations. And brought together this idea that like they really need to be in a group setting together to work through this situation with their peers, and not necessarily, across from their parents, and in a intense setting. A circle is intense. You have to sit still. You got to be, focused the whole time. So this is really an embodied we call it restorative theater, but people get really nervous about theater. It's really just about role playing games, acting it out all through the lens of responsibility and harm reduction. It's really about we understand probably most of these kids are not going to stop, using substances at all. So how do we get you to make better decisions? Don't bring it to school as a first place to start. Don't have it in your car if you're driving. Don't, like come up with ways and that you can interact with it in a way that is a little bit healthier than what you're doing right now. And so they walk out of that process very similar to what happens in a restorative circle of like, these are the commitments I'm making to myself, to the community, to my parents, to my school. And sometimes they have specific, more formal like contract items that come out of that too, that they are asked to complete before their case is like officially closed.
Thank you for sharing. What an innovative program. And I love the fact that itself is the product of a restorative justice circle kind of process between you and law enforcement. So yeah, that's really cool. I know your organization is a data driven organization, and you share some really fascinating data points already. 10% your success rate is at 90% and kind of way above 3 times the rate of the criminal legal system success rate. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the kinds of evidence that you've collected that allow you to confidently say, we know this works. It works in a broad sense. And so, meeting the needs of people who've been harmed, meeting the needs of the community, meeting the needs of, really changing behavior of people who have done harm. So if you could share some of the stories, you mentioned your storytellers. I love if you have
Yeah.
one or two like
Yeah.
really powerful stories you want to share or you
Mhm.
usually share, but also some of the quantitative data that you share.
Yeah. Yeah. We had 2 youth who were referred to our program, in the last few years who both of their families were, immigrant families, and their parents were new here, and bilingual, bicultural families who had, very recently arrived here in Longmont and then found themselves, fairly quickly having to navigate this criminal justice system, which, like, that was even before the moment we are in now. And I just, now all the volume on that is up all the way. And I keep saying to folks, there's never been a more important time to keep people out of the criminal justice system. People are literally being deported for shoplifting with no due process. Like, we cannot let this continue to happen. And so these families were obviously showing up with a lot of them. These 2 moms were the primary, supportive people to their sons going through this, and just so much uncertainty and trepidation. And there wasn't, they just, I don't think they had any idea what they should even do or how it was going to work, what the consequences of that were going to be. And because we are outside of that big bureaucratic thing, and we have incredible staff members who can relate to those folks who share, their experience of being bilingual, bicultural, sort of intuited all of the dynamics that were going on with these moms, and just built this really, really sweet and meaningful relationship. And the process was really as much about supporting these 2 moms getting their sons through this as it was about supporting their sons who were in school together and fighting. And, That's a lot of the cases that we see, and it's very unclear in fighting most of the time, like who is the person who's primarily responsible. And, you have to kind of hold the tension of all of that. And these moms were, saw, but what could this be if our kids could actually get along with each other? Like they have all this shared experience and they need each other. They need to be in community together. And the way all of them so bravely came along was incredible. And one of the moms afterwards let us know that her son had gone out and gotten a job in part to help, supplement some of the family income. That the mom having to take time off of work and things like that. That was like part of his contract, to repair the harm. And so he had given, his family some funds, but then also came home with a gift for his mom. And she was like, it was so amazing. Like he was telling me so much about like how much he loved me and appreciated me and like saw what I had done for him. It makes me emotional just thinking about it. And just that their trust with each other shifted. And then a few months later, we get another update, and like these boys are inseparable. Like they are friends. The moms have become friends. Like they have, like, something was really created from that that would have never happened if they were like forced to go into a courtroom. I mean, if they got, a due process at all, but forced to go into a courtroom and sit on opposite sides. And, that system is sustained by us being in conflict with each other. If we all chose to get along, we wouldn't even, need that at all. And so it's like it has to sort of be perpetuated by keeping people othering each other, by just believing that there is no shared identity here. And um, that theme of people coming together in relationships, seeing each other, seeing the actual impacts, being able to empathize, even for our facilitators and community members, it is who are, often retired folks with a lot of privilege who are also very bravely stepping into something that they may not, be very comfortable with. They are also learning things about these families that we are working with and understanding all of those systems of oppression that are weighing down on them and all of these barriers that are there, that it is not just as easy as like just make sure your kid isn't, in the park at night violating their curfew. And I think we can be so reductive and judgmental, but they come out of that being like, I had no idea. And their relationship is strengthened. We often have volunteers who will say, okay, let me help you complete this contract item that you're supposed to do. Like I will drive you to the thing that you're going to get to. And officers too, if there's particularly, most of the officers who participate in our process are school resource officers. So they're in the schools and classrooms with their kids. They are the first ones to say, okay, I will make that happen. I will get the thing set up with that teacher and your team and the other parents and all of the things to like help you be successful. And I'm going to, hold you accountable to that. And so their relationship is strengthened too. And it's those are like the softer things that happen that are harder to measure, but we have, a majority of people, 99% of people walking out of the restorative process saying they feel like they are satisfied. They feel like the harm was repaired, that the impacts were addressed, that they were heard, that the things that they needed were there was space created for that. People who are responsible saying that they felt like the community understood them, cared about them. We try and measure like, a point in time, like how did you feel when you started this process? And one of the questions is, do you feel like an important member of our community at the beginning of this? And most of them are saying no. By the end of the process, when we ask that question again, all of them say yes. And so that is so incredible to see that, we don't bring them in and say, we hope at the end of this, you feel like an important member of our community. But those are the words they're hearing and the things that I think that they're feeling. And all of those things contribute to changing behavior, and that's really what reducing recidivism is about, is not just changing the behavior of the person who caused the harm, but changing the behavior of the community and the systems and their parents and all of the things. And if we can do that, then there is a very small chance that people are going to go on to, commit other crimes, and that, their crimes are going to escalate and, continue to get more and more impactful. So that's all of those things are really we talk about it being 90% successful, but that wouldn't be true if we didn't have these other components of the relational pieces, the respect, the, commitment to repair, the like really critical part of people taking responsibility and then moving toward, that reintegration, which doesn't necessarily mean it has to be exactly how it was before. That can be like, what is the new norm? I wanted to say one other thing to what you had shared earlier about, or asking about, how we're, sort of shifting all of this process and healing the community through it. And often that also looks like our community members, trained community members, saying to these folks, like, here's what I can take responsibility for how what I do and how I show up also contributes to where you are right now. And I'm going to change my behavior. I'm going to, advocate for this thing, or do, take what I'm learning here and put it into action outside of this room. And so going just back to that, like, everybody in the circle is touched every single time.
And I so love that you actually measure those things. Like, I'm glad that you can share the stories with us
Yeah.
and that you have, the surveys to for people to say, I feel a valued part of the community. There are lots of people, regardless of whether or not they've committed harm, don't feel like that. And when you laid out the difference between, our current criminal legal system cultivates building, it cultivates conflict, and your program is cultivating building bridges and building community. And that is what promotes safety and positive development and healing. And so I'm just thrilled that you actually have the data and can share the stories, and we can amplify that so more people can see really how important it is that we invest in processes like this. So before we leave, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about, to the other people who are listening who aren't participating in the program, but what are some actions that they can take to actually promote, safety and belonging and community in their schools and in their neighborhood?
This is like my favorite question because it's so like, so much of restorative justice is just about curiosity. So I would just say to people, like, get curious about what is happening in your community with restorative justice. We spent a lot of time sort of focusing on the formal part of the work. There's all this preventative stuff that restorative practices also does, that builds the foundation and the fabric and gives us skills and helps us shift our mindset to prevent us ever from even getting to this point where people need formal interventions. And so get curious if you have kids or grandkids or neighbors. Like, what is your local school doing to use restorative practices to promote social emotional learning, to promote culture building, to promote relationships, to promote safety? there's a significant difference in the disproportionality in discipline in schools
Yeah.
when there is restorative practices deeply embedded and restorative justice deeply embedded and when there is not. And so just ask questions. You can probably go to, your school district in your state has to track all of that information. You can find it and, learn something and then go and have a conversation. And then also find out what the restorative justice organizations in your community need. We we need people. Most nonprofits do. We would not be able to function without the free labor of volunteers. And we need, representation of the voices. We need various lived experiences, various identities, various abilities to, show up and be there in order to make all of it work. Even if myself and the 4 staff at Bright could do it all, it wouldn't be effective if we didn't have the community there. So get curious about what other restorative justice organizations are doing. All of the training that we do at Bright is free to the community when folks are coming and volunteering with us. So you can get all of these skills and then you take them into your own life, and it impacts your relationships with your spouse, with your kids, with your aging parents. With the teachers in the school, these are all things you can apply to outside of just this really formal restorative process, and just, work on shifting that mindset. So find out what the RJ organizations are in your community and see what they're offering and get some training. Reach out to us. We train folks all over the nation and all over the state of Colorado, in both how to implement the restorative justice process, but also how to build restorative organizational culture, restorative schools. We're in the middle of piloting restorative approaches to parenting. So there's lots of different ways that folks can get involved, and we would love to hear from them.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So before I totally let you go off and enjoy the rest of your day, I would like to invite you to share anything that, is important that we didn't yet get a chance to talk about. So the floor is yours.
This is something I feel like I've been learning a lot in the last few months because of we've been doing a lot of external training, and we did one yesterday for a group of nonprofits that are participating in a program with the Denver Foundation called Belonging Colorado. Incredible leaders in our community, and people are already doing the work. There's a certain set of jargon and words that are being used in restorative justice, and I try really hard not to use them, but just feel confident and tap into the wisdom of your community, of your elders, of your friends, and know this work is happening, and you may not call it exactly what we call it, but be really grounded in that, and be with other people, and how do we integrate that and elevate that, and what is our responsibility as people who have the wisdom of knowing how impactful it is to operate as a community in this very collective way, to bring that to a very individualized society and culture that others folks that operates from, all of these really negative places. And so the trainings I've been in recently, I'm just you're doing this. I am not the expert. I feel silly, standing up here telling you all, just know that you're already doing it, and you can still, reach out and see how you can bring that to, other places, other organizations. So yeah,
I love
I think
that.
this last thing.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Shalene. This has been a
Oh,
fabulous
thank you.
conversation, and
Thank
I've learned
you.
so much, and I'm sure that our audience will benefit greatly from what you
Yeah,
shared. So thank you
thank
again.
you.